Next, Satish Ukkusuri, who is Associate Professor of Civil Engineering, will describe his work in developing an integrated framework for strengthening the resilience of networks in disasters. He's bringing together ideas, theories, and methods from the disciplines of social science, engineering, and public policy to develop a global perspective in pursuing this grand challenge. And as you recall from last year, we do a fair amount in earthquake engineering here at Purdue University. In fact, we're the center of the NEES network, which is the National Earthquake Engineering System. Satish Ukkusuri, Associate Professor of Civil Engineering, and he's been doing research on network resilience in disasters. And he's going to be talking about an interdisciplinary international perspective, which is based on a workshop that GPRI sponsored. So, Satish, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. So, good afternoon, everyone. So, my name is Satish Ukkusuri. I'm faculty in civil engineering. So, this work is actually in joint collaboration with Professor Daniel Ulrich from Department of Political Science. And this work is broadly related to network resilience, resilience of systems which are interconnected with one another. So the outline of what I really want to talk about is I'm going to discuss about the goals of what this project is about. Then I'm going to talk about what this Network Resilience Conference, the outcomes which we have from this conference, some funding opportunities which we explored as part of this grant, and finally some of the future thoughts that we have related to this work. Okay? So the motivating reason of looking at this particular issue, if you see this graph, so you can see the increasing number of disasters, the frequency as well as the severity of different types of natural hazards that are occurring over time, right? So some of the blips that you see in 95 and then in 2005 is because of like earthquake Kobe and then Hurricane Katrina in 2005. So this shows the number of disasters that have happened. This is the y-axis here. And if you see, there's an increasing number of frequency in terms of the number of disasters. So there's something which we need to do to understand what's going on with respect to how networks are recovering over time, right? So whenever there's a disaster, the first thing is there is a recovery team which is sent to understand the ground truth, right? And there's some data collection efforts after the disaster which happens. But the key question which we are interested in exploring is, what is the functionality? How fast or how soon does the functionality of these networks come back to their initial point once these networks are functioning after the disaster? And what are the things we can do from a policy perspective to improve network resilience in these interconnected systems? So I'm going to define the different networks which we are going to explore more clearly as we proceed to the conference. Okay, so this is one of the motivating reasons of why we are looking at this particular problem. And as I mentioned, the perspective that we have taken is a interdisciplinary perspective, right? So I'm a civil engineer by training, so I do transportation network modeling, where I understand impacts on the transportation system and civil infrastructure system. And Daniel is a faculty in political science, where he looks at a social science perspective of understanding disasters. And when we actually happened to meet and talk about some common ideas, we saw that the issues are similar in terms of addressing these problems. And so we actually wrote this grant, and we wanted to look at resilience from a broader social, technical, and economic type of networks. And so the goals that we have are, we want to develop a theoretical framework for understanding network resilience, incorporating notions from multiple disciplines, including engineering, social science, economics, and political science. Then we want to create foundations for ongoing and future interdisciplinary global collaborations. So at NSF, there is a initiative to integrate social behavioral sciences with engineering sciences to understand disasters. So this is one of the preliminary works which we are doing to fit into that initiative. And we want to strengthen Purdue's capacity in disaster science and engineering and collaborations with various international partners. So there are researchers on Purdue campus who work on disasters in different departments, in engineering, in sciences, in business school, and so on. And we wanted to bring all of them onto the same platform, discuss ideas, and see commonalities across these different techniques. So we had different tasks in this project. The first one was to first speak the same language, because when I say resilience, it's not the same as Daniel talking about resilience. So there's no commonality in terms of the notation and terminology which we are using. So the first thing is to conceptualize this problem so that we can really understand what we mean by network resilience, what we mean by a network itself. And then we developed a preliminary framework for understanding this disaster resilience from different viewpoints. And we had specific hypotheses based upon data we have from previous projects to answer some questions related to social and infrastructure resilience. And then we organized an international workshop on Purdue campus last April. And one of the goals was to publish journals and disseminate the work from both this workshop as well as research that we have done. So I just want to briefly touch upon each of these different tasks that we have here. And we have also explored a few funding opportunities. So there are some new NSF grant opportunities which are present, so which we have looked at. There's a NOAA funding opportunities on natural hazards and resilient communities. There's a Department of Homeland Security grant on building resilience communities and some World Bank funding. So we have identified some funding opportunities over the last 1 year, which we are currently pursuing to explore this issue of resiliency more broadly. And as part of this research, we also developed collaborations with various universities across the world, specifically in India, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, where I have visited multiple times to give presentations. So Dr. Janki Andarya, who leads the Logistics Institute at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, and then Dr. Michelle Blimier from Delft University of Technology, and Dr. Sawada from University of Tokyo. So they actually came to this conference and they presented their perspective of network resilience, especially challenges in emerging countries like India with respect to collecting data and understanding resilience type of issues. And this is, in my opinion, one of the first projects which attacks this problem from an interdisciplinary perspective, which brings together perspective of both social sciences, looking at the problem very broadly, understanding the different issues, and from an engineering perspective, developing tools and techniques to capture network resilience. So this is a brief outline of the conference. So we had a good coverage by the media, by both the local and some national media of the conference, and there were about 60 to 70 attendees from academia, agencies, and industry. And in the morning, we had a closed-door session to have an intellectual discussion about various issues related to network resilience. So the morning session was more of a closed-door session, trying to build this framework of network resilience from these different perspectives. So we had people from economics, from engineering, from social sciences, and from the business school, trying to understand what network resilience is, telling their definitions of network resilience, the issues with respect to data collection, and how each of these are intertwined with one another. In the afternoon, it was an open session, and we divided this into invited talks. We had 3 invited talks, and we had 2 roundtable discussions, one focusing on the social sciences perspective and one on the engineering perspective. And we had representation from the Brigadier General Margaret Washburn. She was present and she gave the keynote lecture at this conference, and international perspective from Japan, India, and the Netherlands. So in summary, the panel discussion mainly focused on trying to really define what network resilience is. Are there some common techniques, common terminology that we could articulate in terms of defining network resilience? So for example, in engineering, the way we define network resilience is the ability of the system to come back to its original operating state after it has been succumbed to a shock, right, like the disaster. Whereas in terms of social sciences or in other disciplines, the perspective is somewhat different. It could be the communities coming together and building a framework for them to bring this not necessarily to the original condition, but at least to 70 or 80% of the previous condition, right? And the second goal was to kind of identify performance metrics to measure, to kind of gather data related to network resilience. And there was an extensive discussion of experience with real-world disasters. So I have done previous work and I have some ongoing work on looking at hurricanes in the Florida coast area. So I have data from Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Rita, Hurricane Ivan, and we have discussed about how we can use those data sets to measure network resilience. And a key item which we actually wanted to focus in this discussion was the role of different networks, social networks, infrastructure networks, economic networks, political networks, the role of these different networks and the interdependencies across these different networks in terms of improving and aiding network resilience. And we also discussed about some of the emerging topics in these various disciplines. What are some of the problems? What are the challenges which they see from their perspective in terms of making network resilience to work for their disciplines? And then the linkages across these various disciplines. So we have a summary of the discussion which is captured by the notes that we have prepared by two of my graduate students. And so we have a very rich discussion of all of these different issues, which we hope will be very useful to have a good understanding of this interdisciplinary notion of network resilience. And PCCRC greatly helped us in terms of organizing this conference. I really want to thank them for helping with the organization of this conference. So briefly speaking, I mean, not to go into all the details, this is one of the perspectives. So this diagram here captures the essence of the discussion that happened during the discussions that we had in the morning sessions. So here you can see that these two circles represent two different notions of resilience, one from a social capital perspective and one from an infrastructure perspective. So for understanding the social capital, we need to understand how communities bond together, how they bridge together, how they link together when these disasters happen. For example, if you look at the Kobe earthquake or even the preliminary data that we have from the Tohoku disaster last year, we see that the communities in Japan actually coalesce very well just after these disasters as compared to other areas, for example, New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. Right? So we need data to be able to capture this bonding, bridging, and linking social capitals. And what can we do to strengthen the community ties? So that's one important. What are the things we can do from the policy perspective to strengthen community ties? So there are some leaders within the community who act as central nodes. They could be pastors, they could be political leaders who could help us to improve and accelerate this network resilience. And the rate of recovery with time based upon the population, how many people return back, and this is a function of the infrastructure. So if you recall Hurricane Katrina, most of the people in the lower Ninth Ward did not come back because their homes were not fixed, the infrastructure was not fixed. But the infrastructure was not fixed because no one was living there. So it's a chicken and egg problem. Which comes first? Which do we need to fix first is an issue which needs to be understood in an integrated manner. right? And similarly, on the infrastructure side, there are issues with respect to transportation, water, communications, energy, which we need to address when these disasters happen. We need to understand issues related to safety, accessibility, and the condition of this infrastructure over time just after the disaster happens. So this interplay between this social and infrastructure is one important element which we want to capture in the research that we want to do in the future. But for this, the key element is to be able to get good data from various hazards. So we have some data from the hurricanes, Katrina, Ivan, and Rita, and some data from the tsunami in the Indian Ocean, which we want to use to kind of measure some of these variables. And finally, our goal is to develop actionable policies which can help us to get a good understanding of network resilience. So some of the outcomes, we have a report which summarizes some of these findings, and more importantly, we have a network of collaborations which we have initiated to understand this important topic. So both on Purdue campus as well as with international partners, right? So we created this platform of all the people who can collaborate, talk, and discuss about ideas related to disasters across, both within Purdue and across international partners. And we also involved a couple of graduate students to look at this notion of network resilience from a multidisciplinary perspective in various stages of this conference. Specific outcomes, we have a couple of journal publications which are under preparation by me and Daniel, and we have submitted one NSF grant as a result of the work funded from this seed grant. That is to a joint social behavioral program as well as an engineering program at NSF, focusing on disaster resilience in rural communities. And then we recently submitted a Center for Global Partnership, which encourages partnerships between Japan and the United States to look at issues related to the data collection and the recovery issues in the Tohoku disaster. So this is something which we have recently submitted, and we are looking forward to actually collecting data in the Tohoku disaster. So in the immediate future, we want to continue to write proposals based upon the ideas that we have from this grant to NSF, USAID, and NOAA. And we also want to continue to write joint publications on network recovery and resilience. But our long-term goal in the next 2 to 3 years is to take this collaboration on campus and with the international partners to the next level in terms of setting up a center type of activity on campus related to disaster science and disaster management. So, but our perspective, as we have seen in this presentation, is an interdisciplinary perspective. So it's not just going to be engineering tools or social science perspective or economic perspective, but bringing together notions from all these different disciplines to understand disaster management. I think that's my last slide. Yeah.
This paper is open for discussion. Yes, Jim.
I don't know if there's a question here or just a comment. This is extraordinarily near and dear to my heart after coming through a October snowstorm that dumped 30 inches of heavy snow and wiped out the electric system in Connecticut for 2 weeks. One of the things, I guess, two things I'd encourage you to think about, and this is, again, this is a selfish kind of electric system perspective. One of the things we are struggling with right now is how much to spend on hardening the system. And there's a very, I think, interesting science to be thought through around, you know, you showed the chart that showed the increase in these number of events. Where does that go over the next 20 to 30 years? And therefore, you know, the 100-year storm now becomes a 20-year storm. And the 20-year storm now costs 5 times as much as it did 3 years ago because property values escalate. And I think there's a thing that policymakers are really struggling with, which is what should be the planning environment going forward, and how much to pay, which is an insurance question, I think. The other thing that we found, which was interesting to us, was even relative to 2 years ago or 3 years ago, when we had similar scale outages, is the proliferation of digital commerce and digital communications completely changes how people think about the electric system. For example, it used to be when the power went out, you had to cook on your grill and you had to read by candlelight and maybe you had to sleep with a blanket at night. Well, now you don't have internet connectivity. You can't transact because so much of transactions are digital these days. Your kids are climbing the wall because they don't have any of the stuff that keeps them busy. And most importantly now, half of this is, again, Connecticut, which is a screwy place. Half of the homes don't have landlines, and the ones that do, half of those are VoIP. So if you lose power, you lose communications as well. And I think about kind of your emphasis here on rural communities, and just imagining no communication, no power, I can't pump gasoline. The magnitude of these things doesn't require a Katrina-like event to be enormously disruptive. And I think as kind of digital economy continues to progress, this problem is going to be really, really important, not even at the mega disaster scale you're talking about, but at the routine snowstorm or ice storm or something like that.
But that's a very good point. So while we are focusing mainly on these huge disaster type of events like Katrina, the tsunami, the floods, and so on, the techniques and the tools will also be applicable to these type of disruptions in supply chains or disruptions in infrastructure. But I think one issue which you brought up is very important, which is the interdependence of these networks.
Yeah.
Right? So when your electricity network goes out, it's dependent upon your communication network. It disrupts your transportation network because your subway is not running because it runs on electricity. It disrupts your water network. So there's linkages across these different networks which one has to capture here.
The water issue is really interesting because so many of the people in Connecticut have septic systems and wells. Right? So they were knocked out. So they have no water, no communication, just no pumps.
That's true.
Satish, thank you. Very, very interesting topic and discussion, of such world importance. I'm just again following on the previous conversation. The graph you showed. I mean, it's an exponentially increasing graph from 1900 to the present, and I wondered, is it all to do with there's Fukushima and such disasters, of course, were due to earthquakes that we can't attribute to things like global climate change. But my question is, in your statistics, prior to 1900, your suggestion is that we've had a very, very big increase in natural disaster. Is that?
So there's a big increase in the frequency of natural disasters in the recent. The causality, I mean, it's very difficult to kind of attribute to. I mean, there are studies which attribute to global warming, climate change, and so on, right? And the evidence is probably very tight in that instance. But so what we are trying to show in that graph is that it's likely that this frequency and severity of these natural hazards is going to increase over time. Yeah. So we should be better prepared in terms of our recovery efforts, and we should be better prepared in terms of understanding this resilience.
No, absolutely. I'm convinced of that. But just on the statistics level, one would presume that there were lots of disasters, in the past that weren't as recorded as they should have been, etc.
Or before 1900.
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. We don't have data for that. That's right.
I have a question for you, Satish. I know you've studied the Haiti earthquake, and I think you pointed out to me that the situation there is just as it was 2 years ago, which is an example of a totally non-resilient society. But maybe it's a maximum adaptation society. Everyone's adapted to tents now. What are your comments on the situation in Haiti, and how would you compare that with the situation in Japan now, a year after their major disaster, in terms of social resiliency?
So in Haiti, I think, the problem, I think it's actually there are two contrasting pictures. So in Haiti, I think the biggest issue is that there is lack of the social linkages in these communities, and there's lack of political will to get things done. Like now, people have started to live in tents, and some of you might have seen this New York Times graphic, which showed this number of tents on month one after the disaster and after the end of year one. And you can see that in the month one, it was probably 1/10 of a football field. But at the end of year one, it was like 3 or 4 times the football field. Right? So it has grown, the number of tents have grown because nothing was getting done. Right? So you can see that there was no mechanisms there to improve network resilience. Whereas in Japan, after Kobe earthquake, we see that there is a lot of important players and there's a lot of tight-knit communities which actually improved network resilience, and things started getting back to normal very quickly.
See, there's a question. Yes, Moira.
In the socioeconomic area here, it's in 1906 there was a big earthquake and City Hall burned, and we're still talking about how it was really hard to hold on to your house and you also land everything and so forth for years. So these things run deep. I was interested in what you said about Katrina, because it is back to the Ninth Ward and yet anywhere in the world area where they had the severe damage. Also, the property, as I understand it, the property records were underwater at the City Hall. And also, there are a lot of lower socioeconomic people. And when Aunt Josie died, but you were living in the house, and then there was many generations where they never changed the property records whatsoever.
Right.
And there was, as I understand it, great reluctance to even come back and claim your property. In addition to everything else, plus how would they determine who owned what, where and when?
Right.
That's sort of an after the fact. How do you determine who has that, especially when there's a low socioeconomic aspect to all of it? It's like you're not even going to begin. You don't go down to the courthouse and say, "Hey, I'm here."
Yeah, no one wants to claim it.
There's a whole lot of other records that could be there for you that you don't want to know about. So is that part of that?
Yeah, it's part of that. We really did not look into that issue very carefully. But when I visited New Orleans and we went to the mayor's office, we went to different agencies, this issue came up repeatedly. But that was not really the part of the study that we have. But the issue of properties not being claimed, and one of the reasons being that the infrastructure is not in place, or they don't have good recording systems to actually know which properties belong to which people and so on. So yeah, that's certainly an issue.
The same thing in Dresden after World War II. Today, about every other house in some housing districts in Dresden are empty. They've been empty for a long time because the property records were lost, and there's too much legal contention over the ownership of the house, and so there's no incentive to improve the house, and it just sits there. Any other questions on this presentation? If not, thank you very much, Satish. And